Good Shabbos. This week's portion, Parshas Vayera, amongst other things, deals with how do you deal with innocent civilians? What are we talking about? The city of Sodom and Amorah. And what does the Torah tell us about Sodom and Amorah? It says that Sodom and Amorah were royim v'chatoyim l'Hashem miyod. They were very wicked and sinful before God. So we have a city which we know eventually is destroyed by sort of fire coming down from heaven. And we know that God intended and found it necessary to destroy that city. But we also have Avraham pleading with God for the people of the city. And really, there's two instances where Avraham did that. The first time was when he got a report that there was a war between 4 kings and 5 kings, and that the 5 kings, including Sodom and Amorah, were defeated in war, and the people were taken captive. And amongst them was his nephew Lot, who went to live in that city. And what happens? When Avram hears that his nephew Lot has been taken captive, he goes to war and he fights and he frees him. And he reestablishes the cities of Sodom and Amorah. So right there you see that Avram was really, in a sense, influenced by his own particular familial needs. He wasn't thinking, it seems, about the nature of Sodom and Amorah, whether maybe it's good that they were destroyed by those kings and the people were captured because they were very sinful. He only thought about Lot. And because he thought about Lot, he saved the city. And what happens? Later on, God comes down and he says, I see they're still very sinful. They have to be destroyed. And this time he tells Avram in advance what's going to happen. And what happens? Avram right away argues with him and he says, will you destroy the tzaddik, the righteous, with the wicked? Perhaps there's 50 righteous people in the city. Will you not carry the whole city because of those 50? Then he goes on to say, will you kill the righteous with the wicked? And the righteous will be treated like the wicked? It's impossible that the shofet kol haaretz, the judge of all the earth, lo yaseh mishpat, should not do justice. Now here Avram is mixing in 2 different arguments. The one argument he's saying is if there's 50 people, it's a worthwhile city to save. Perhaps it's not fair to destroy a city where those 50 people will be left homeless. And also you might argue that those 50 people would be enough to influence the city and save them from their wickedness. It's not clear what he's arguing, but he's saying that they should be saved. And then he's saying, besides that, if you're going to wipe out the city, what happens to those 50 people? And God just says, no, I wouldn't do it because of that. He doesn't really answer to Avram which argument is the one which would work in that case. But it seems that if there's a sufficient amount of innocent people, or righteous people, as Avram puts it, then God would not have destroyed the city. And then Avram just keeps arguing. He says, what if there's 45? Because there's lacking 5, you're going to wipe out the city? And he goes down 40, 30, 20, 10. And each time God says, no, I wouldn't do it because of that. But there's not enough people. Now, what the amount of people you need to save a city is hard to understand from this argument. Is it a percentage of the people? Is it a certain critical mass? It's not very clear. But what you see in this discussion is really the issue that we really want to discuss today, is that there are innocent civilians, and here they're not even innocent. He's saying they're tzaddikim, they're righteous. Whether that righteousness means that they're not sinful or that they're actually good people, it almost doesn't matter. But they're innocent people there. And there's different approaches. So the first time Avram, when there's a war, he thinks, my nephew's there, I'm going to save them. He goes to war and saves them. He doesn't think about the fact that the Torah already told us that it's a wicked city. The next time, he argues with God, and notice when you read this story, he doesn't mention Lot, his nephew. He's now thinking not so much just as his own family, but he's saying as a philosophical point of view, isn't it immorality? Shouldn't morality tell God that he shouldn't be wiping out the city? And the message that God seems to say is that no, sometimes you have to destroy the city. Sometimes there's so much wickedness and evil that innocent people will suffer. But what's fascinating about this story is when Avram walks away, he's given the impression that the whole city will be wiped out since there's not 10 righteous people. And as the commentaries point out, it seems that there might have been eight. It might have been Lot, his wife, his four daughters, and two of his sons-in-law. And at the end of the day, only he and two of his daughters are saved. But God saves them, and he tries to save his wife and his other two daughters and sons-in-law. But the two daughters and sons-in-law refuse to go, and famously the wife of Lot looks back, and she turns into a pillar of salt. But Avram didn't know this, and he didn't tell Avram that. So there seems to be, again, a tension here. Avram is walking away with the impression that sometimes there will be, using the term that we use today, collateral damage, and that sadly Lot might be killed because God felt that the city shouldn't have a right to exist anymore. But God then saves Lot. And again, does that always happen in war? No. That's the tension that I think we have to always deal with. But there's one other lesson that we have in this story, that what happens to the two daughters that he tries to save and the sons-in-law, they laugh at him and say, no, we're not going. In other words, they're happy with the life that they have. Are they righteous? It seems so. If they would have agreed to go, they would have been saved. But they weren't willing to judge the people that they were with. They were silent, perhaps, in the fact that these other people were ra'im v'chatoim, that they were so evil. And you have to argue that Lot also. Lot chose to move there knowing that those people were evil. So Lot was also guilty to a certain degree, but he still seems to have been righteous enough to be saved. And again, this is the issue we have with innocent civilians. For example, in Gaza, do people support Hamas? But if they support Hamas, is that just because that's the government and the leaders that they know? That doesn't necessarily mean these people are not innocent. It's very hard to know. And the last point, as I mentioned, I want to make is what happens to Lot's wife. Lot's wife turns back and looks after she's told by the angels not to look back. And she's turned into a pillar of salt. And what's the message there? I think it's very simple. That it's one thing to be righteous, another thing to be innocent and to be saved. So you could say she was looking back and seeing the destruction of those wicked people, and she wasn't righteous enough to be saved and see their suffering. But another explanation might be she still longed for her past, which is understandable. She lived in Sodom. For all we know, he married a local girl. That was where the rest of her family was, her friends. Everything she knew was in Sodom, her home. She was leaving it. So it's understandable that she turned back. But really, the message might be that no, you have to know when you have to leave, when you have to move forward, when you can't look back, when you can't be related and have any connections or ties to such an evil society. So do we have the answers that we need practically for a war today? No. We only have all the different issues. There are innocent civilians. Sometimes it's enough to save a whole city, country. Sometimes it's not. What are the numbers? We don't know. Should those innocent civilians be collateral damage, as Avram seems to have accepted, or does God step in and say, no, these people have to be saved? Are there any set rules? Does it always happen the way we wish it would? I don't know the answer to these questions. I only want to show that these are issues which were dealt with already in biblical times. And these are the questions that are presented in the Torah. And how you understand them and how you make the application will be how you conduct yourself in a war even today. Good Shabbos.